The first few mornings at Elias Rourke's cabin passed in silence, broken only by the sound of the wind against the pines and the slow crackle of the hearth. Clara woke each day unsure whether she was a guest or a burden. Her bruised wrists ached, her body sore from nights of restless dreams. Yet each time she stirred, she found small acts of kindness waiting. A bowl of porridge left warming on the stove, a pitcher of water set neatly beside the cot, and once, even a wildflower in a chipped cup on the table. Elias spoke little. He rose before sunrise to tend the horses and returned only after the morning frost had melted. His movements were steady, deliberate, and strangely gentle for a man built like stone. When he did speak, it was with a calm certainty that made Clara feel safer than she wished to admit. By the fourth day, she gathered the courage to offer help. "I can earn my keep," she said quietly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. Elias looked up from sharpening his axe. "You don't owe me anything." "I'd rather work than sit useless," she replied, eyes downcast. After a long pause, he nodded toward the house. "There's bread to bake, I suppose." From that moment, the rhythm of their days began to shift. Clara swept the floors, washed his shirts in the creek, and filled the cabin with the soft scent of baking bread. She moved with care, never overstepping, never asking too much. But slowly, she began to hum while she worked, quietly at first, almost as if afraid to hear her own voice, Elias noticed. He didn't say so, but the melody lingered in his ears long after she stopped. One evening, as rain began to fall hard against the roof, Clara stood by the window watching lightning dance over the hills. Elias sat at the table mending a bridle strap. She turned to him suddenly and asked, "Why did you help me?" He kept his eyes on the leather as he spoke. "Because I've seen what people do when they think no one will stop them." "Someone hurt you," she said softly. He didn't answer at once. The thunder rolled in the distance before he replied, "My sister." Her name was Martha. The town said she lied about the man who took advantage of her. They turned their backs on her. "She took her own life 2 winters later." Clara's breath caught. "I'm sorry." Elias set the strap down and looked at her for the first time. His eyes were dark but not cold, haunted perhaps, but full of an unspoken vow. "You reminded me of her that day in the square," he said. No one should have to beg for mercy. The storm outside howled like a wild thing, and Clara felt something shift between them. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of unspoken understanding. When the fire flickered low, Clara gathered her courage and said, "Mrs. Hargreaves' son. He's the one who put the brooch in my trunk. I wouldn't let him touch me. He said he'd make me regret it." Her hands trembled as she spoke, but her voice did not break. Elias stood, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Does the marshal know?" She shook her head. "Who would believe me?" He stared into the flames for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, "I believe you." It was the simplest thing anyone had ever said to her, but it broke something inside. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth as tears slipped free. She didn't weep loudly. She'd learned to cry in silence. But Elias stood there, saying nothing, just letting her be, like a man guarding the fragile thing that was trust. When she finally looked up, his voice was low but certain. "You're safe here, Clara, I'll see to that. Outside." The storm raged until dawn, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace had begun to take root, a quiet before the next storm neither of them yet saw coming. The days after the storm were bright and deceptively peaceful. The land shimmered under a clean sky, and for a while it almost felt as if Willow Creek had been left behind forever. Clara smiled a little more. She fed the chickens behind the barn, learned how to grind coffee beans the way Elias liked, and even ventured to hum while she swept the porch. But peace, as the prairie often taught, never stayed long. It began with the sound of hooves, 3 sets, pounding hard against the dirt road. Elias looked up from the fence he was mending, his hand freezing mid-motion. He recognized that rhythm, lawman. Clara was at the creek, rinsing clothes, when she heard the riders approaching. Fear swept through her body like an old ghost returned. The clang of spurs, the creak of leather. It was all too familiar. She dropped the washboard, hands trembling, and hurried back toward the cabin. 3 men rode into view, dust trailing behind them. At their head was Marshal Dugan, his mustache bristling, a silver star glinting on his chest. Behind him, 2 deputies shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. "Rourke!" the marshal called, reining in his horse. "We've got business." Elias wiped his hands on his trousers and walked forward, calm but ready. "I figured you might." The marshal's eyes narrowed. "You took a fugitive out of my custody. That girl belongs to the town court." "She's not a fugitive," Elias said evenly. "She's a woman who was tied to a post without a trial." "That's how we do things when a thief's caught red-handed," Dugan shot back. "You've got no right to interfere." By now, Clara had reached the porch, pale and shaking. "Marshal," she said softly, "please, I didn't steal anything." "I swear—" "Quiet!" Dugan barked. "You can tell your lies to the magistrate." "Now come along," Elias moved between them. "She's not going anywhere." A heavy silence fell. The deputies shifted again, glancing at one another. No one in town had ever seen Elias Rourke defy the law so openly. Dugan's eyes hardened. "You planning to fight me on this, Rourke?" "You know the penalty for harboring a criminal." Elias didn't blink. "And you know the penalty for false accusation, Marshal." "You should have done your job before letting a crowd play executioner." The tension snapped taut as a whip. One of the deputies reached for his holster, but Elias's hand was faster, his revolver drawn and leveled before anyone breathed. "Don't," he warned, voice low and calm. Dugan's horse sidestepped nervously. "You'd shoot an officer of the law?" "I'd defend an innocent woman," Elias said. "There's a difference." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Dugan raised his hands in surrender. "Fine," he growled. "But this isn't over. The folks in town are talking, Rourke. They say you've lost your senses over a servant girl." Elias's expression didn't change, but his eyes turned cold. "Let them talk." "They always do." The marshal turned his horse sharply. "You'll regret this." When the riders finally disappeared into the distance, Clara sank onto the steps, her breath coming fast. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "Now they'll come after you, too." Elias holstered his revolver and crouched beside her. "Let them try," he said simply. "You don't fix what's wrong in this world by bowing to it." Clara stared at him, torn between gratitude and fear. "They'll say awful things about you." "About us?" He gave a faint, crooked smile. "They already do." For a while, they sat together in silence, the prairie wind rustling the grass around them. But inside Clara's chest, old wounds reopened, the memory of every whisper, every cruel glance, every time someone had called her liar, thief, or worse. That night, as Elias dozed in the chair by the fire, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She realized that peace had fled again, replaced by the steady, creeping dread that the world would not rest until it dragged her back down. And yet, when she looked at him, at the man who had risked everything to protect her, she also knew something else. This time she would not face it alone. The morning sun had only just begun to burn through the mist that clung to the edges of Willow Creek, but already a crowd had gathered in the town square. The air was thick with dust, murmurs, and judgment. Men leaned on hitching posts, spitting tobacco and shaking their heads, while women clutched their shawls tighter, whispering words that stung sharper than the wind. At the center of it all stood a young woman, thin, trembling, her wrists bound to a wooden post with rough hemp rope. Her name was Clara Mayfield, though few cared to remember it. A crude sign hung around her neck. Thief. The letters were painted in black tar, ugly and uneven. She'd been tied there since sunrise. Her knees ached from standing. Her lips were cracked from thirst, and her heart was raw with shame. The accusation had come swiftly and cruelly. Mrs. Hargreaves, owner of the Willow Creek boarding house where Clara worked as a maid, claimed her brooch, a family heirloom of silver and turquoise, had vanished from her dresser. Clara had denied it, swearing through tears that she'd never touched the thing. But the townsfolk, eager for spectacle, needed no trial. A servant girl with no family, they muttered. Always trouble. So they tied her up for all to see, a warning to the others. Clara tried not to cry, but the humiliation burned too deep. She could feel the eyes of every man, woman, and child crawling over her. Some looked away, pretending pity. Others smiled as though justice were being served. She thought of running, but the ropes bit too tightly. She thought of shouting, but who would listen? When the clock struck 9, the crowd began to thin. A few lingered, idly tossing pebbles at her feet. Clara lifted her face toward the sun and whispered the only words left in her, "Please, let me go." That was when she heard it, the sound of hooves. A rider emerged from the road, dust rising around the legs of his chestnut horse. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low against the light. The people stirred as he rode closer. Everyone in Willow Creek knew him by sight, Elias Rourke, the quiet rancher who lived beyond the canyon. A man who kept to himself, who'd once been a deputy before tragedy hardened his soul. He dismounted slowly, tying his reins to a post. His boots crunched through the dirt as he walked toward the square. The marshal called out, "Best stay clear, Rourke." "Town business." Elias didn't answer. His gaze fell on Clara, her tear-streaked face, the bruises on her wrists, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of shame she didn't deserve. Something twisted in his chest. Years ago, he'd seen his own sister bound by cruelty just like this, accused, shamed, and left to die by people too proud to admit their wrongs. He stepped closer. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying through the square. "Justice," said Mrs. Hargreaves from the steps of the general store. "She stole from me." Elias looked at Clara again. "Did you?" Clara's lips trembled. "No, sir," she whispered. For a moment the air hung still. Then, without another word, Elias drew the hunting knife from his belt. The crowd gasped as the blade flashed in the sunlight. In 2 swift motions, he sliced through the ropes. Clara's knees buckled, and he caught her before she hit the ground. "That's enough," he said quietly, glaring at the onlookers. "You ought to be ashamed," Mrs. Hargreaves sputtered. "You can't just—" But Elias was already lifting Clara onto his horse. "I can," he replied, "and I will." As he swung into the saddle, the marshal called after him, "You're meddling in town justice, Rourke." Elias looked over his shoulder, voice like thunder. "Then maybe this town's justice needs fixing." With that, he spurred his horse and rode off toward the horizon, the girl clinging weakly to him. Behind them, Willow Creek fell silent. For the first time, shame hung not on the accused, but on those who had tied her there. The world swayed beneath Clara as the horse galloped through the prairie. She clung weakly to the stranger's coat, too dizzy to keep her head upright. Wind rushed past her ears, carrying away the shouts of the townsfolk until they were nothing but ghosts in the distance. All she could hear now was the pounding of hooves and the steady rhythm of the man's heartbeat beneath her cheek. When the horse finally slowed, they were far beyond Willow Creek. The open land stretched endlessly, dotted with sagebrush and shimmering grass. Ahead stood a modest log cabin tucked beside a creek, smoke curling faintly from its chimney. Elias dismounted and reached up to help her down. "Easy now," he said. His voice was low, gravel and warmth together. Clara's legs gave out the moment her feet touched the ground, and he caught her again, steadying her gently by the shoulders. "You're safe here," he murmured. "No one will bother you." Clara wanted to speak, to thank him, but her throat felt raw. He led her inside, past a rough-hewn table, a small stove, and a shelf lined with old books. The place smelled faintly of pine and saddle oil. On the wall hung a faded photograph of a young woman with Elias's eyes, his sister, though Clara didn't yet know her name. He motioned toward a chair near the fire. "Sit." When she hesitated, he gave a faint smile. "It's all right. You've had enough orders for one day." Clara sank into the chair, trembling. The heat from the fire licked her chilled skin. Elias poured water from a kettle and set a cup before her. She wrapped her hands around it, staring down as if afraid to look up. He watched her for a long moment before asking, "What's your name?" She glanced up, startled. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara, he repeated softly as though testing the sound. All right, Miss Clara. Tell me what happened. Her fingers tightened on the cup. They said I stole, but I didn't. I swear I didn't. Her voice cracked and she bit her lip. Mrs. Hargreaves found her brooch in my trunk, but I never touched it. I think her son put it there. She stopped, shame flushing her cheeks. Elias didn't press her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the way her words trembled under the weight of something darker. After a moment, he nodded slowly. You don't have to explain more tonight. You need rest. He stood and pulled a blanket from the bed in the corner, laying it across a cot near the fire. You can sleep here. I'll be outside with the horse. Clara's eyes widened. You're leaving me alone in your home? Elias's brow furrowed slightly. Why wouldn't I? She looked down again. Most men wouldn't be so kind. Something flickered in his expression, a mix of sadness and anger. Then most men are fools, he said simply. He moved toward the door but paused, hand on the frame. I meant what I said in town. You didn't deserve that. When the door shut behind him, Clara felt a tear slip down her cheek. Not from pain this time, but confusion. Why would a stranger risk the town's wrath for someone like her? Outside, Elias sat by the dying light of the fire pit, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His mind replayed the sight of her tied to the post, the same helplessness he'd seen years ago in his sister's eyes. He had failed one woman once. He would not fail again. Inside, Clara lay awake on the cot, listening to the creek's murmur through the window. For the first time in a long while, she felt something stirred deep within her chest. Not fear, not despair, but the faintest spark of safety. And when she finally drifted to sleep, her lips moved silently in the darkness. Thank you, stranger with the knife. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to press low upon the earth. Elias saddled his horse in silence, his movements deliberate, his jaw tight. Clara stood in the doorway, clutching her shawl. She wanted to speak, to ask where he was going, but fear held her still. Finally, she whispered, You're going back, aren't you? Elias didn't answer right away. He tightened the strap on the saddle, then said quietly, They won't stop, Clara. The marshal. The Hargreaves family. They'll keep coming until the truth's plain to everyone. But they'll twist it, she said, stepping toward him. They always do. You can't fight the whole town. He turned then, his gaze steady and unreadable. Maybe not, but I can make sure they think twice before hurting you again. Before she could reply, he mounted his horse and tipped his hat. Lock the door. I'll be back by sundown. She watched him ride away until he disappeared beyond the ridge, his figure swallowed by the rolling plains. The emptiness that followed was sharp and cold. Elias rode hard for Willow Creek, his mind a storm of fury and resolve. He'd lived long enough to know how the world worked. Men like the Hargreaveses never faced consequences unless someone forced them to. He was done watching good people be broken. By the time he reached the town, the sun was high. The main street buzzed with the usual crowd, men lounging outside the saloon, women gossiping on porches. Conversation stopped as Elias dismounted. The townsfolk parted silently as he strode toward the saloon doors. Inside, laughter died the moment he entered. Tom Hargreaves, Mrs. Hargreaves' son, leaned against the bar with a smirk, a glass of whiskey in hand. Well, well. The hero rancher returns, he drawled. Come to defend your little thief again? Elias's voice was quiet, but it carried through the room. I came to clear her name, Tom chuckled. You can't clear what's already dirty. Without a word, Elias walked past him, up the stairs to the boarding rooms. The crowd followed with curious murmurs. He kicked open Tom's door and began to search. Drawers, shelves, trunks. Within minutes, his hand closed around something cold beneath a pile of clothes. A silver and turquoise brooch. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Elias held it up high, his jaw clenched. Seems justice missed a spot. Tom's face drained of color. That doesn't prove... Elias stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You planted it on her, didn't you? When Tom tried to shove him, Elias caught him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. You think you can shame a woman and walk free? He growled. Not in my town. Not again! The marshal, drawn by the noise, burst in just in time to see the brooch glinting in Elias's fist. Dugan's eyes went wide. "Is that—" "It is," Elias said, "and you're going to make this right." The next morning, news spread like wildfire. The marshal had verified the brooch's ownership and taken Tom into custody for theft and false accusation. The town buzzed with uneasy whispers, some angry, some ashamed. But for Clara, the damage was done. Her name might be cleared on paper, but gossip ran deeper than justice. When Elias returned that evening, she met him on the porch, her eyes red but steady. "You did it," she said softly. "You proved the truth." Elias dismounted and nodded. "You can go back if you want. No one will call you a thief again," she shook her head slowly. "Back? To the people who tied me up and watched me cry?" Elias looked away, guilt flickering in his eyes. "You deserve a fresh start, Clara, not a prison made of whispers." She took a step closer. "Then let me start here." He froze, the words sinking in. "I can cook, clean, help around the ranch," she said. "It's not charity if I work for it." After a long silence, Elias nodded once. "All right," he said quietly. "But on one condition, no more bowing your head." "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." And with that, under the fading gold of sunset, a promise passed between them, unspoken but binding. He had freed her from the town's rope, but now she would have to learn to live free of its shadow. Autumn crept gently across the prairie. Mornings came wrapped in mist, and the fields beyond Elias Rourke's ranch turned the color of honey and rust. For the first time in years, Clara Mayfield began to wake without dread tightening her chest. The nightmares still came sometimes, the jeering crowd, the coarse rope, the word thief echoing in her mind, but daylight chased them faster now. Elias never asked about the dreams. He seemed to sense when she'd had one. On those mornings, he'd leave a mug of coffee and step outside to give her space. When she finally emerged from the cabin, his calm, steady presence was enough to ground her. In time, Clara began to move with quiet purpose. She mended curtains, scrubbed the wooden floors until they gleamed, and baked bread so fragrant it carried through the open windows to the barn. Sometimes she caught Elias watching her from the porch, his hat tipped low to hide a smile. "Careful," he teased one afternoon as she pulled a pie from the stove. "You keep cooking like that, I might never let you leave." Her cheeks flushed, but her voice held a spark of playfulness. "Who says I'd want to leave?" The silence that followed was gentle, almost shy. Elias looked away first. Evenings on the ranch became their favorite time. They'd sit by the hearth, the room bathed in amber firelight, and talk in slow, halting fragments about things neither had spoken of before. Clara told him about her mother, who died when she was 10, and the long years spent serving strangers. Elias shared memories of his sister, Martha, the way she'd laugh at his clumsy dancing, the wildflowers she'd press between pages of her Bible. "I wasn't there when she needed me," he said once, staring into the flames. "I was too busy working, trying to make a life worth something. When the town turned on her, I thought someone else would step up." Clara's heart ached at the quiet torment in his voice. "You can't carry all that alone," she whispered. He glanced at her then, the firelight catching in his gray-blue eyes. Maybe not anymore. That night she dreamed not of ropes or shame, but of open fields and laughter carried by the wind. As the weeks passed, the ranch began to feel like home. The horses grew fond of her, the chickens followed her as if she were one of their own, and the cabin no longer felt borrowed. She found herself humming while hanging laundry, smiling when Elias returned from the range. There was safety in their silence, comfort in their shared routines, yet beneath that calm, something unspoken simmered. When their hands brushed while passing a dish, or when he guided her onto his horse to ride into town for supplies, the air between them seemed to hum with something fragile but powerful. One evening, Clara woke from another nightmare, the old fear, the square, the laughter. She slipped outside into the cold, clutching her shawl around her shoulders. The moon hung pale and full above the hills. Elias found her there, barefoot in the frost. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear them again." He hesitated, then stepped closer and draped his coat over her shoulders. They can't hurt you anymore, Clara. Not while I'm here. Her voice trembled. You've done enough already. Not near enough, he said, his tone roughened by something deeper than anger. I couldn't save Martha, but I can keep you safe. She looked up at him then, eyes shining with tears and moonlight. You already did. He didn't move to touch her, didn't need to. The words hung between them, pure and unguarded, warming the cold night air. When she finally went back inside, Elias lingered under the stars, watching the cabin's light flicker through the window. Somewhere inside, he knew, the wounds they both carried were beginning to heal, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, everyday mercy of being seen and believed. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, love could grow from ashes. Winter crept over Willow Creek like a rumor. The wind turned sharp, rattling shutters and whispering through dry grass. For a while, life at the Rourke Ranch carried on in quiet peace, until whispers from town began to find their way across the plains. It started with the supply wagon. Elias noticed the driver, old Mr. Bennett, growing curt. He avoided Clara's eyes and made excuses about missing shipments. The sacks of flour came lighter, the nails rusted. Folks talking, Elias, Bennett muttered once, not quite meeting his gaze. Say you're keeping a fallen woman. Say you lost your mind over her. Elias's jaw tightened. You believe that? Bennett hesitated, then sighed. Doesn't matter what I believe. Matters what the town believes. And with that he drove off, leaving a trail of dust and silence. Clara overheard the exchange. She didn't speak of it, but that night she scrubbed the dishes until her knuckles bled. When Elias came in, he found her staring into the soapy water, her reflection warped and broken. You heard, he said quietly. She nodded once. They'll never stop, will they? No matter what you proved. Elias set his hat aside and stepped closer. You can't spend your life trying to change small minds. Let them talk, but she shook her head. It's you I'm worried about. They'll turn on you next. He almost smiled. A sad, crooked thing. Let them try, yet even he couldn't deny the change. Men who once traded with him now refused his business. The smith stopped sharpening his plow blades. A neighbor sent word that the county committee was reconsidering Elias's grazing rights. Every kindness in town was shrinking into cold politeness, and at the center of it all stood Tom Hargreaves, out of jail now, his mother's wealth smoothing over his disgrace. He wore his hatred like a fine coat. When he passed through town, he made sure his voice carried, Rourke's keeping her out there like his own personal whore. One of Elias's hands broke a whiskey glass when he heard that. A week later, Clara went to fetch water from the creek at dawn. The air was brittle with frost, and her breath formed little ghosts in the air. As she bent to fill the bucket, she heard a rustle, a horse's snort in the distance. Then came the faint scent of smoke. Her heart lurched. She turned, eyes widening. From the ridge, a ribbon of black smoke rose into the pale morning sky. The barn. Clara dropped the bucket and ran, her boots slipping in the mud. The barn was ablaze, flames leaping like wild beasts against the winter sky. Inside, the horses screamed, "Elias!" she shouted, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. He was already there, throwing open the doors, his face streaked with ash. "Get back!" he yelled, but she didn't. Together they freed the horses, slapping their flanks to drive them out. Sparks stung her arms, her hair singed, but she didn't stop until the last animal was clear. By the time the fire was out, the barn was gone, only charred beams and smoking ruin remained. Clara sank to her knees, coughing, shaking from exhaustion and fear. Elias knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "You could have been killed," he rasped. "So could you," she shot back, her voice breaking. "You think I'd just watch?" He stared at her, chest heaving, then pulled her into his arms. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles," he murmured into her hair. Clara's reply was muffled against his chest. "You didn't give up on me, Elias. I won't give up on you." They held on to each other as the snow began to fall, soft flakes hissing as they met the smoldering remains. Above them, the first light of morning spread across the plains, turning ash into silver. The town would whisper louder now, They both knew it. But for the first time, Clara wasn't afraid of the noise. She'd rather burn beside the man who freed her than live safely among those who'd tied her down. Days after the fire felt heavy and strange, like the world was holding its breath. The smell of smoke clung to everything: clothes, walls, hair, even the bread Clara baked to make the cabin smell like home again. But no matter how many candles she lit or windows she opened, the air still carried the bitter tang of ruin. Elias rebuilt the barn with his own hands. Every swing of his hammer echoed with anger. Anger at the men who'd done it, at the town that looked the other way, and maybe, deep down, at himself for not being able to protect her from their hate. Clara helped where she could, bandaging his burned palms and steadying the ladder when he worked past dusk. But she saw the toll it was taking on him. His jaw was always clenched. He barely spoke. And when she tried to ease his burden with soft words, he'd only say, "It's fine, Clara. Don't you worry." She did worry, because she knew that kind of silence. It was the same kind she'd once used to survive. A week later, Sheriff Dugan rode up the hill. His horse kicked dust over the frost as he dismounted. "Mornin', Elias. Miss Mayfield." Clara stiffened. The sheriff hadn't looked her in the eye since the day Elias cut her loose. "What brings you here?" Elias asked, wiping sweat from his brow. The sheriff sighed and took off his hat. Town's in an uproar. "Someone's saying the fire wasn't an accident, and that you two set it yourselves." Elias froze. "Come again?" "They're claiming you torched it for sympathy, that you're trying to stir trouble before the land council hearing." Clara's heart dropped. "That's a lie." "I believe you," Dugan said quietly. "But Tom Hargreaves is telling it loud. He's pushing for a public hearing, wants to make it official." Elias's voice turned cold. "Then I'll see him face to face." 3 days later, the town gathered in the square, the same square where Clara had once been tied and humiliated. Snow drifted down like ashes, and the sound of murmuring voices carried through the air. Elias stood beside her, tall and unflinching, though his hands trembled slightly beneath his gloves. Clara could feel the tension in him like a storm about to break. Tom Hargreaves arrived late, wearing a smirk and a fine wool coat. His left arm was still bandaged from where Elias had broken it months ago. He played his role perfectly, the aggrieved gentleman wronged by a crazy rancher and his harlot. The sheriff called for silence. "We're here to settle accusations of arson against Elias Rourke and Miss Clara Mayfield. Mr. Hargreaves, you may speak." Tom stepped forward, his voice oily and loud. "We all know Rourke's temper. We've seen what kind of woman he keeps. She burned her bridges once, why not his barn too?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara felt every gaze like a knife. Her throat tightened. But before she could speak, Elias did. "You think I'd burn my own home?" His voice rang across the square, hard and steady. "You think she'd risk her life to save horses from a fire she started?" "You weren't there, Hargreaves. You've never seen courage a day in your life," Tom sneered. "Careful, Rourke. You hit me once already." Elias took a step closer. "And I'll do worse if you ever come near her again?" The crowd gasped, but then something unexpected happened. Old Mr. Bennett, the supply driver, spoke up. "I saw smoke before sunrise that day. Came from the ridge behind your place, Tom. Looked like someone riding away fast." The murmurs turned to whispers. Uncertain now, doubtful. Sheriff Dugan cleared his throat. "That'll be enough. Until we've got proof, this hearing's closed. But I'll remind folks, spreading false witness carries its own penalty." Tom's face twisted. But he said nothing as the sheriff turned him away. When it was over, Clara stood in the same place where once she'd begged for mercy. The same wooden post stood nearby, weathered and splintered. But this time she wasn't bound. Elias took her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles against her skin. "You don't owe this town anything," he said quietly. Clara looked up, her voice trembling but strong. "Maybe not, but I won't run anymore." And as they walked away together through the falling snow, the whispers faded behind them, like echoes losing their power at last. The wind came down from the mountains, sharp as a blade, carrying the scent of snow and pine. Winter had tightened its grip on Willow Creek, and with it came a silence too deep to trust. After the hearing, Elias and Clara returned to the ranch, but peace did not follow. Word spread that Tom Hargreaves was gathering men, drifters, ranch hands loyal to his family name. He'd been humiliated before the whole town, and humiliation in a man like Tom always turned to violence. Elias knew it was only a matter of time. He spent the next days in the barn he'd rebuilt, oiling his saddle, checking his rifle, sharpening the hatchet. Clara watched him from the doorway, her hands twisting in her apron. "You're going after him, aren't you?" she asked. Elias didn't look up. "He won't stop. Not after this. And I won't have you sleeping every night wondering when he's coming." "Then I'll go with you." He turned, eyes fierce. "No, you stay here. Lock the door. If anything happens—" She stepped closer, her voice trembling but resolute. "I've been hunted before, Elias. I won't be left behind again," he wanted to argue. But when he saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had kept her alive when the whole town turned on her, he knew she wouldn't yield, so he nodded once. Then we ride at dawn. The morning came gray and cold. Frost silvered the grass, and the world felt like it was holding its breath. Clara wore Elias's old coat, too large for her, and a scarf that smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. She rode behind him, her hands gripping his waist as they crossed the frozen fields. They found Tom's camp before noon, deep in the canyon near the old silver mine. 3 men lounged near a fire, their laughter echoing off the rock walls. Tom stood apart, leaning against a boulder, his pistol resting easy on his hip. Elias dismounted, every muscle in his body coiled tight. "You set my barn on fire," he said flatly. Tom smiled, slow and mocking. "Prove it," Clara's voice cut through the cold. "You almost killed the horses, Tom. You could have killed me." He turned toward her, his expression twisting. "Should have finished the job. Would have saved this town the trouble." Before Elias could move, Tom's hand went for his gun. The next moments blurred, the crack of a pistol, the scream of startled horses, the smell of gunpowder. Clara dove to the ground as Elias's bullet struck Tom's hand, sending his gun spinning into the snow. But one of Tom's men fired back, grazing Elias's shoulder. He stumbled, blood seeping through his coat. Clara scrambled to his side, grabbing the fallen rifle. Her hands shook, but her aim was steady. "Enough!" she cried. "No more!" The men froze. Something in her voice, raw and desperate, cut through the chaos. Tom fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding hand. His face, once smug and untouchable, was pale with fury. "You'll regret this, Rourke. You think the law's on your side?" Elias leveled his rifle at the man. "The law had its chance. Now you're gonna leave this county and you're never coming back." Tom spat blood into the snow, but when he saw Clara still aiming the rifle, his defiance cracked. "Fine," he hissed. "You can rot in this God-forsaken valley for all I care." He climbed onto his horse with his injured men, and by the time they disappeared over the ridge, the only sound left was the wind howling through the canyon. Elias sank to one knee, clutching his shoulder. Clara tore off her scarf to press against the wound. "You're bleeding bad," she whispered, her voice breaking. He winced but managed a half-smile. "I've had worse. You nearly died," she said. "For me." He met her eyes, voice low and rough. "No, Clara, for us." She leaned into him, her breath trembling against his chest. The world around them was still, snow, silence, and the faint smell of smoke. For the first time, she realized that the fire they had survived had burned more than wood and walls. It had burned away fear, shame, and everything false between them. And what was left, raw, fierce, and fragile, was something neither of them had dared to believe they'd ever find again. Snow fell thick and silent over Willow Creek that night, blanketing the land in a hush so deep it felt almost sacred. The ride back to the ranch was long and cold. Elias swayed in the saddle, pale from blood loss, but he refused to let Clara stop to rest. Only when the cabin came into sight did his strength give out. She caught him before he hit the ground. Inside, Clara built a fire with trembling hands, tearing the hem of her dress to bind his shoulder. The room glowed gold against the storm outside. When she finally sat beside him, her own body shaking with exhaustion, she realized she was crying, silent tears that she hadn't even noticed. "You should rest," Elias murmured weakly. Her hand tightened around his. "Don't you dare tell me what to do right now." A ghost of a smile flickered across his face. "You're bossy when you're scared." "I'm alive when I'm scared," she whispered. "And you almost weren't." He squeezed her fingers, his eyes finding hers through the dim light. "You saved me, Clara, again." She shook her head. "You saved me first." For a long while they sat in silence, two broken souls stitched together by the same firelight that once separated them. Outside, the storm howled, but inside, peace began to take root. The following days passed in slow rhythm. Elias healed, though stubbornly, and Clara nursed him with a gentleness born from deep gratitude. She fixed his meals, changed his bandages, read to him from an old Bible she'd found on the shelf. At night, when his fever rose, she sat by the hearth, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. The ranch, though scarred, began to breathe again. The horses returned to their stalls, the hens began to lay, and the land, like them, seemed to be finding its strength after ruin. One morning, Elias stepped out onto the porch, his arm still bound in linen, but his posture tall. The sun had broken through the clouds, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Clara joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Looks like a new start," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "It feels strange. Not being afraid anymore." He turned toward her, eyes steady. "You don't ever have to be." For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with everything they'd left unsaid. The pain, the forgiveness, the quiet, growing love that had bloomed from their shared suffering. Finally, Clara said, "When you cut that rope in the square, I thought you were just being kind. I didn't know you were saving my life." Elias looked at her, his gaze tender and unflinching. "And when you stayed, when you didn't run after the fire, you saved mine." She swallowed hard, her breath misting in the cold. "What happens now, Elias?" He smiled, slow, uncertain, but real. "Now we live. We build again. Together if you'll have me." Her heart thudded. She hadn't expected the words, though maybe she should have. Every day he'd shown her, without saying it, that love didn't need grand promises. It grew quietly in the spaces between hardship and hope. Clara took his hand. "I already do." That night they ate supper by the hearth, 2 bowls of stew, the fire crackling low. There were no speeches, no vows, just the quiet joy of being alive, of being free. Outside, the stars hung over the prairie like lanterns, and the wind whispered through the pines as though the land itself was blessing them. Later, when Elias reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face, she didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her heart finally unbound. Months later, when spring returned to Willow Creek, the townsfolk noticed something different. The ranch at the edge of the valley stood proud again. New fences, green pastures, laughter carrying across the hills. And sometimes, when travelers passed through and asked who lived there, the locals would smile and say, "Just a man and a woman who walked through fire and came home from the ashes."